we've got a really great panel here, and I'm hoping we're going to have a really, not interesting talk, but a really interesting dialogue that's not just going to get to the heart of the question, which is being asked, is it a war, is it genocide, but it's going to give some depth of understanding about the people who are saying whatever it is they're saying. So I'm going to start with very brief introductions to people, and I'm banking on the fact that you'll go along with how we're going to go. Okay, let's do this in no particular order then. First of all, let's have a go. Chris Williamson, many of you will know, ex-Labour MP, now in a different form of politics. I'm going to leave it to Chris to actually say something really about what makes your political thinking happen the way it does, what motivates you.
I suppose I was politicised by going to a Catholic primary school, actually, and that taught me a sense of solidarity, because in those days we had corporal punishment, and I remember on one occasion when a couple of my friends had knocked over a bird table and destroyed it, and Sister Pius came in and demanded to know who had done the damage, and we all refused to own up or to identify the culprit. So she said that she would cane every single boy in the class, and that way she would get to the culprits, and we'd also be punished for not obeying her order to reveal who had actually damaged this bird table. So in a sense, I suppose that's where I kind of learnt my solidarity. You know, we always kind of stuck together and never ever would, as it were, undo our friends. We always stood up for one another. So I guess I learnt that from a very early age. And I think I was influenced by people like Ken Loach, because back in the 1960s and 70s, you know, there was a lot of political dramas and things like that on the TV, and I think that's generally we were still living in the post-war consensus, and a sense of social solidarity was something which was still very tangible, I think, and so I think it was my school days.
So it was an experience of brutality, really, of punishment.
Well, partly that, and partly the kind of cultural influences, and the influence of my parents, who were of that Second World War generation. Okay, great. Next we have Ileana Chan, who has a great YouTube channel, Empire Watch, and her real interest is really looking at American imperialism from a global South perspective. Ileana, what would you say to the question?
Hi, everyone. I would say that even though I was born here in the UK, I have a father from Malaysia and a mother from the Philippines. And so that means I have a father from a post-colonial country and a mother from a de facto US military colony. And when I was 9, I moved back. Well, I moved to Malaysia. We all moved to Malaysia. And so I was sort of thrust into the context of being in a post-colonial country that was basically, all of us were basically gaslit. Our understanding of our own history and how the British Empire formed Malaysia, that was formed in 1965. Most people don't even know what the British Empire did or how we were formed. And so my understanding of politics comes from the feeling of being gaslit, being sort of silenced. Everybody was silenced. And I'll give you an example just to make it a little bit clearer what I'm talking about. So in Indonesia in 1965, there was a genocide, right? A lot of people don't know that, though. So once I was interviewing on my show an Indonesian journalist, And she talked about how her grandfather was just never talked about. And it was only in university that she realized that one day the police came to her door and her grandfather was just taken. And they never heard anything about him ever again. And so but then now she realizes that was part of the Washington-led anti-communist campaign that was basically wreaking havoc across the global south and really across the world for decades, you know? And so that type of thing where it's like you're told one reality, but you know something's wrong, is very much like part of why I started this podcast, to look at U.S. empire and to define U.S. empire and how it's still wreaking havoc across the world. And being British, our active participant in that empire. That's how I got to here.
And I think many of us really know a bit of what it feels like to be gaslit, don't we, after the experiences of the last few years. Thank you. Asa, electronic intifada journalist, what was it that got you?
I'm, as you said, Jackie, I'm a journalist, and I write, for those of you who don't know, I write and report for the Electronic Intifada, which is a website that focuses on Palestine. I would say we're the leading news source on Palestine in the English language. And we have a weekly live stream. We report on the genocide in the Gaza Strip. And I report on that. I report on what's happening in Palestine in general. I've lived in the West Bank, reported from there. I also report on issues like the Israel lobby, the pro-Israel lobby in the UK specifically, and things like that. So my first contact with the Palestinian cause was through the anti-war movement. So I was brought up in a religious family of non-conformist Christian pacifists, and so when the Iraq war was starting to happen, I took that pacifism very literally, and I started to go to anti-war demonstrations, and I got that was my contact with the Palestinian cause, because of course on all those demonstrations in London, you know, I'm from South Wales, but I'd moved to London at that point, and at those demonstrations there would always be the Palestinian flag, because it was 2002, the second Intifada was happening, and so that started a process of education and self-education, lots of reading, go to seminars, talks, and the most educational thing was actually going to Palestine.
Yeah.
Actually going to Palestine. I ended up, at first I was there as an activist, and I ended up doing media work for the activists, and that, you know, in a lot of ways got me my start as a journalist. But the most educational thing of all was actually contact with Palestinians, living among Palestinians, seeing how they live in the West Bank. I've never been to Gaza, unfortunately, but the West Bank, and just seeing this was 2005, 2006 while I was there. But so, you know, nearly 20 years ago. But even then, it was so raw, the apartheid nature of it, of the colonization process. You know, contrary to all the stereotypes about Arabs and Palestinians being violent, uncivilized, dirty, all of these lies. It's a very welcoming society.
Yeah.
It's a very multicultural society, multi-ethnic society, multiracial society. People don't realize this. Just being embraced as a foreigner, even though I'm from Britain, which is actually the core of the problem, which actually triggered the colonization of Palestine and support for the Zionist movement, still being welcomed as a human being and just seeing people's lives there. So that's really what led me to kind of dedicate my life and my career to reporting on the Palestinian cause. Because what Palestinians would always say was, because I was involved in this activist group and we were participating in non-violent direct action support for Palestinians, but they would always say to us more than anything was, go back home, tell our stories, try and change your countries, because that's where the problem's coming from.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, this counter to the lies that we're told about other people and about ourselves, and how something will tick you off and you'll suddenly go, hold on, this is not actually real, this is not what's actually going on. Okay, Franck Magennis, some of you may have heard of him already, I certainly have. He's doing this extraordinary job as a communist lawyer representing Hamas to have their prescription de-prescribed. Now that must be a really interesting role to take. So Frank, what was it for you? What's it been for you?
I would describe my politics as communist, and I wasn't always a communist. I sort of went on a journey to arrive at communist politics, and I suppose there's not enough time here for me to properly talk about that journey. It's like, in some way, there's this whole process of accumulation. I'm very grateful to comrades over the years who challenged my politics and made them sharper. I would say that I think my route to communism started in the occupied north of Ireland, where I grew up. And I had this sort of experience of the tail end of what's sometimes called the Troubles. So I had this experience of the violent domination of the British Empire in the north of Ireland. And I think I just developed this politics which was based upon rejecting domination. Like, I just don't like being dominated. And, you know, Hegel has this really, like, Marx was obviously very heavily influenced by Hegel. Hegel has this very interesting stuff about master-slave, relationship. Like, really, in the relationship between the master and the slave has the true power, because at any point the slave has the power to refuse domination and to reassert the human equality between master and slave, and to refuse that dynamic. And so I think for it to mean anything, communist politics has to be about an opposition to domination. In terms of moments where my commitment to a kind of, I would say, liberal, romantic Irish nationalism that I've now rejected, this kind of, I'm Irish, I came to England to do my undergrad and was very kind of opposed to British people. Like British people were personally responsible for the colonization of Ireland, which is a politics that I now reject. And it was a lot of English communists who were among the people who helped me on my journey towards communism. And I would say there's this one moment that sticks out in my mind, and it's quite a ridiculous moment. My friend Ashok Kumar was organizing a rave in solidarity with some Bangladeshi migrant workers in East London. And I was outside this rave talking to this Trotskyist guy. I was still kind of relatively confused in my politics at that point. And this woman came up and overheard the conversation between the two of us. And I've never met her again. I never got her name. And she listened to the conversation, and then she just interrupted and said to me, "Are you a liberal or a communist?" And I gave this really confused postmodern liberal answer. And halfway through my answer, she just said, "Oh, I see, you're a liberal," and walked off. And it's like, I still think about it. I'm still here talking about it today. It's like, it was this very powerful provocation. She was like, "You don't know what you are." And she was right, and it forced me to reckon with what I wanted to be. And so I chose communism. And so I think thinking about domination, thinking about the fact that I'm Irish, I grew up in the north of Ireland, is part of it. But I'm here to suggest that anyone can choose to have the correct position. Anyone can choose to have good politics. I would suggest that we should all be communists. I think that we should side with the international working class in their struggle against the forces of the bourgeois capitalist state and the US-led totality that is dominating people. I don't think we can understand the genocide in Palestine without understanding the way that global reality is determined more than anything else by US capitalism. But I hope that's a kind of meandering, rough and ready history of how I came to my politics. I just think we should spit in the face of people who try and dominate us.
Well, that's a suggestion. Yeah. Okay, Patrick, your thing is the 21st century wire, isn't it? And you came through a convoluted sort of travel, both geographically and personally as well, didn't you?
Yeah, so I grew up in 1970s and 80s America, so during the Cold War, but also is coming out of the Civil Rights Movement. Post-Vietnam, so America was going through a type of a situation, and so I was a product of that. Our politics were kind of directed, and our view of, American, you could say, empire, if you will, was kind of informed on that basis. But it wasn't until I left America that I first encountered people who were really anti-American traveling around the world, and that was a little bit of an education at that point. And so what I do, I went to art school, so I come from art and design, photography. So when I do journalism, I study I study everything right down to the typography.
Yeah.
So I learned Russian constructivism. That was part of my design education. So everything I do is that deep study. So I try to see a granular details, and that's, I think, helped me a lot in becoming a journalist in my second, third, fourth, fifth, or whatever, I think sixth career that I'm on right now. So but Palestine, 25 years ago in the Second Intifada, I lived in a predominantly Palestinian neighborhood in London, West London, in Fulham actually, and it was that's when I really got my education from the people I knew in the neighborhood. That I remember coming downstairs on North End Road Market and seeing Mahmoud, who was a friend of mine, in tears on the street. Why are you crying? I've never seen, always happy. Always, full of energy. And they took me aside, told me I lost my cousin in the fighting in the West Bank, and I wasn't really that, in the late 90s, I wasn't really that au fait with this issue. I was just politically learning things, and that began a process, and that community treated me like a family, basically. And it was a kind of my adopted family in a certain way, and that kind of got me on the road to, in fact, if it wasn't for that moment or that issue, I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now.
Yeah.
So it's, it's been an interesting journey, yeah.
It's just extraordinary, isn't it, how some encounter with somebody, you're just doing whatever you're doing, maybe going down to have breakfast in the cafe down the road, or maybe you've changed your job, or very often travel can just change your whole perspective on what things are and who we are. Craig, you've had a very particular journey too, haven't you? Craig was British ambassador, and so a diplomat of some standing, and you've travelled and you've also encountered.
That's true, and to start from the beginning, my politics were formed by sexual lust. I was at university in 1976, and there was a Lebanese student I fancied desperately. Her name was Marwa, and she took me to join the Friends of Palestine. And she took me to the table to sign up for the Friends of Palestine, and there, sitting the other side of the table, was a very young George Galloway. I never did get anywhere with Marwa, but I became lifelong friends with George Galloway.
Was that a good deal?
It's the deal I got. I'm not going to go out. So I was active and knew about the Palestinian cause from the mid-70s, and I was involved with George in getting Dundee twinned with Nablus, for example, in the West Bank. My life then took a rather different turn when I passed the exams to enter the diplomatic service after I left university. I joined the Foreign Office, and I worked my way up. I was in the fast stream, and I worked my way up through. I became the head of the Foreign Office Maritime Section, the deputy head of the Foreign Office Africa Department, and eventually I became ambassador to Uzbekistan, which at the time was a hot potato because it borders Afghanistan, and this was 2001 when I was appointed. And I was Britain's youngest ambassador, so my career was, in conventional terms, my career was extremely successful. But then I came across the Torture and Extraordinary Rendition program and found the CIA was sending people to Uzbekistan in order to be tortured. And when I tried to have this stopped, I discovered that Jack Straw and Tony Blair had both okayed this. We were complicit. We were part of that. So my life then took a radical turn. I blew the whistle on the Torture and Extraordinary Rendition program, and as a result, I was sacked. And I then went on to work with WikiLeaks on whistleblowing and with other whistleblowers around the world, and also to put my knowledge of diplomacy and international law at the service of good, if you like, as opposed to at the service of an imperial state. And to give one example for that, a guy called Sam Husseini, who's an extremely good Washington journalist, contacted me last October or 2 Octobers ago and said, why is nobody activating the Genocide Convention against Israel? So I drew up a paper on how to activate the Genocide Convention. That paper was published and was also given to another colleague, Andrew Feinstein. Andrew introduced that paper to the South African cabinet, and that paper of mine was on the table in front of the South African cabinet, along with other papers, on the day that they decided to take Israel to court at The Hague for genocide at the ICJ. So I had a hand in initiating that, and I was in the... I was in the ICJ on that day, sitting alongside another friend, Jeremy Corbyn. I was in there for that. So, and I was also in the High Court for the Palestine Action Prescription hearings leading up to the forthcoming judicial review. And I've been buzzing around the country trying to support activists who are being arrested under this terrible persecution we're suffering at the moment. So, if you like, I started as a radical. I became part of the establishment. I came across the establishment doing things that are so terrible in terms of torturing innocent people that I could not live with it. So I went back, if you like, to the side of good, and have been enthusiastically trying to make up for my lapse in joining the establishment ever since.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I think that's a great segue into the main issue at hand, really, which is this question, which in a way I find quite an awkward question, because part of me wants to go, come on, everybody knows that this isn't genocide, because I actually believe they all know that this is a genocide, but they're gaslighting all of us at the moment in terms of what it is. So, Asa, what's your take on this? I suppose in a way I'm more interested in the kind of process of being gaslit, or what's the political rationale for doing it, but what's your take on this question?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Well, my take is kind of a nuanced one. I mean, there's two main things to say about this. The first is that, on one level, it obviously is a genocide. I mean, I've quite often used the word Holocaust, you know, with a small h, in reference to what's happening in Gaza, because it is such a mass scale, such a deliberate scale, so openly declared. And so the word war is not really fitting, because a war gives an impression of something like what is happening in Ukraine, for example, where there are, you know, the complexities aside, there's two armed states battling each other. Yeah. Whereas this is a situation of an indigenous people fighting against a settler colonial entity, and it's asymmetrical. It's very, very highly asymmetrical. And so what is happening on a mass scale is that the civilian population is being targeted. You know, that is the whole point of it. You know, and so all this constant propaganda in the mainstream news about, well, they don't really use the phrase collateral damage so much anymore. That seems to have gone out of fashion. But that's the sense of what they're trying to say is, oh, well, you know, it's a tragedy when civilians are killed, etc., but it's all Hamas's fault, all of this kind of nonsense. So on that level, yes, it is a genocide and not a war, of course. But I would say my take is that it's actually both. It is a genocide and it is a war at the same time. And the reason for that is that to make another comparison with the Second... I mean, I don't want to compare everything to the Second World War and the Nazis, but, you know, as I'm 46 years old, someone growing up in education in this country, you're always constantly taught about World War II, so it's hard not to make other comparisons. And there are comparisons to be made between what the Nazis did to the Jewish people and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. I don't want to say it's exactly the same, but there's definitely comparisons. And one of them is this, which is that the Nazis and Israel, what they've got in common is that they were both carrying out a genocide at the same time as losing a war.
Yeah.
So that's you know, the Nazis were ultimately defeated by the Soviet Union and its minor allies, but they still eradicated, on an industrial scale, more than 6 million Jews alone. Not to mention, tens of thousands of tens of millions of Russians as well,
And 6 million others too.
Yeah. So millions and millions of people eradicated in an industrial scale genocide, but there was also a military conflict happening at the same time, which they ultimately lost. And what happening in Gaza is not exactly the same, of course, but there are those similarities. There is a genocide happening on an industrial scale. The civilian population of Gaza is being deliberately, rounded up into metaphorical ovens and killed on an industrial scale. The tents of the refugees are being deliberately targeted.
Yeah.
People are burned alive in them.
Yeah.
But there is also a war happening between the Israeli military and the forces of the Palestinian resistance. It's not the same as World War II. It's a guerrilla war. It's an asymmetrical war.
Yeah.
But they are still fighting, and that is happening. And we talked about this in the panel yesterday. It's happening to such an extent that we're reaching the point where, one of the things I do in my job is I read the Israeli press quite a lot. And when you look at what the Israeli press is saying, they are starting to worry about the collapse of the Israeli army.
Yeah.
I don't want to be too over-optimistic about it, but they are saying there is signs of that.
There was a figure I read the other day which said, and I don't know how accurate this is, but that there are 80,000 casualties, Israeli casualties. And if you look at how small the place is, that's a significant number. And only today I read about another officer this time committing suicide.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon, yeah.
It is actually phenomenal.
I think the official figures are much lower than that, but there's absolutely no doubt. So I don't know the true figure, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was on that scale.
Yeah.
I mean, they're absolutely lying about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Craig, can I just turn to you because, in between having a festival and preparing for this, I was reading a social media post from you yesterday, which was talking about the number of children who had been killed in Ukraine and in Gaza. And I found the percentages that you were talking about astonishing. I'm not sure, but it was something like, well, you'll know better than me. What were the figures?
Yeah, no, in the Ukraine, where there's a war, a genuine war happening, the percentage of those killed on both sides, the percentage of those killed, the total percentage killed, the total of all those killed, the percentage of those who are children is 0.3%. That's a real war. Unfortunately, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 children have been killed, and that's a terrible thing. But that's 0.3% of all those killed in the Ukraine war. And that's what you get when children are regrettably killed in war as collateral damage accidentally. 0.3%. In Gaza, the percentage of those killed who are children is 37.7%. That's not collateral damage,
no.
That's deliberate. Then that, for me...
That's about the percentage of the population of Gaza.
Precisely. That is simply what you get if you are eliminating an entire civilian population at random. You're killing children at random just as you're killing adults at random. And to me, that statistic in itself proves this is not a war, this is a genocide. You're killing all of the population, old, young, female, children, male, whoever, they're all just being obliterated at random. And 37.7% of those killed so far have been children, compared to a real war where that figure would be something like 0.3%. In the whole Second World War, even including the Holocaust, and even including things like the fire bombings of Dresden, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which obviously killed a lot of children. In the whole Second World War, the percentage of all those who died who were children was about 6 to 7%. We're talking here 37.7%. That's deliberate obliteration.
I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it? Because I think that's very symbolic as well. It has a symbolic meaning as well as an actuality. First of all, you're trying to sort of obliterate the future of a people. Secondly, they are actually targeting children. And, that goes back to the idea that we are being gaslit, because whenever we actually say that this is what's happening, it's denied us. But also, it's a form of psychological warfare against the Palestinian people. Because if you really, really want to try and psychologically destroy a people, you destroy their children, you destroy their actual hope. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I think that's right. The other point I want to make, which is a rather drier point, is that the public understanding of the legal meaning of genocide is not high. People seem to think that in order to achieve genocide, you have to wipe out an entire population. That's not what it is. The Genocide Convention defines genocide as killing members of a group because they are members of that group. There is no so, for example, Srebrenica was found by the International Court of Justice to be an act of genocide, even though we're talking far, far lower numbers of dead and not actually a significant percentage of the Kosovan overall population. But it's still genocide because they were killed merely because they were Muslim.
Yeah.
And what is happening is undoubtedly a genocide, because when, children are being killed in numbers proportionate to their percentage of the population, you can see a population is being wiped out merely because of their ethnicity, not because of anything to do with them being active combatants.
That's great, thank you. Okay, well, thinking about gaslighting, I'm going to come to you, Ileana, because I think this is something that many of us have experienced, not just during this period, but it's something that because of our background, our identities, our cultural, if you like, homes, we've experienced for some time. Ileana?
Yeah, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial to see where we're going. It might not be controversial. Everyone might agree with me, which will be awesome.
Okay.
But since... well, I will just preface it to say this is not the controversial part. The ICJ presentation that, the argument that Craig referenced, just to be really clear on whether or not Gaza is a genocide, right? That was 750 pages of text for why Israel is committing a genocide, and 4,000 pages of annexes and exhibits. And that was presented in October of last year.
Yeah.
So in terms of the amount of documentation that we have about this being a genocide, there is no doubt. But there's a lot of confusion. And I would say that is very, very intentional, because we live in a country that is part of the imperial core. And if we think about, okay, so just to explain, and I'll get to my point that's controversial in a little bit, but to explain what I'm talking about is that we are part of the inner circle of the US empire.
Yeah.
And the definition that I'm using is the Tricontinental Research Institute's dossier on hyper-imperialism, which defines the US-led imperial bloc as 49 countries. And they look at it in terms of like concentric circles. So we're in the inner core circle, the six of us, Five Eyes, the traditional Five Eyes. And if you don't know what the Five Eyes are, it's UK-US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. We all share intelligence. But now we can sort of define that Israel is part of the Five Eyes, so it's now Six Eyes, because of the special relationship between the US and Israel, i.e. the US shares intelligence with Israel, and so it is ultimately Six Eyes. But my point with this is the US empire is massive. So I think a lot of times people are like, oh, if only people knew about the genocide, if we could just define it as a genocide, then it would stop, right? But when we're looking at the US empire and how big it is, we have to think about how does it actually, first of all, it's not a natural state. There's nothing natural about the US empire because all it does is stick and no carrots. So who the hell would want to follow the US empire if they had a choice? So how it works is that it basically works in terms of three main pillars of coercion. You've got the military power, financial power, that's like the IMF, World Bank, SWIFT banking system, the US dollar is a world currency, etc. And then the third one is propaganda. And that is why even this question of Gaza, a genocide, not a war, even the fact that we have to argue about that now is part of that propaganda.
Exactly.
It is to make us confused and to argue about, more children are starving to death, as if the invasion in Iraq was, which was under false pretenses, as if that's fine, because that wasn't a genocide, but this one is, so now we better pay attention. And why hasn't it stopped? That whole thing, it's like, it's offensive to make us keep arguing about this over and over again. And so I think my point, so where the controversial thing comes in, we are the problem. We are the most genocidal force in the world, not me and you, and I'm shaking because I feel that strongly. But it's obviously not me and you, but it is our governments, it's us part of the US empire. It is not Russia, it is not China. There is no other country that can actually take the place of the US in terms of this type of imperial structure. Because like I said, those three pillars are huge. Because if you look at propaganda, it's not just the media, it's the entertainment, it's our educational system, it's NGOs, it's humanitarian aid, it's think tanks. You know what I mean? It's international law to a great degree. So we're talking about something that is so massive that even the question in this panel, which I'm delighted to be here, but is offensive.
Yeah, but I mean, the interesting thing I think for me as well, and coming in terms of being from, a group of people who are in the world majority, i.e. people of colour, but who are talked about as being a minority, which is a lie. We're not the minority, we're the majority of the world here. That we are sort of gaslit continually on this kind of issue, and the shock of actually accepting the fact that we actually, at the moment, are the baddies here. And to some extent, the propaganda that is happening is sort of offering a lifeline to help blind us from what we would otherwise do, which is, it wouldn't just be 80 or 100 or 150,000 people on the streets. It should be 5 million people out on the streets. It should be us withdrawing our labour, because if we actually believed what we were being told by the people who know what is going on, that is what we're doing. So it's a proper head fucker, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I just want to add one part. I just want to say, even though that was like terribly depressing in some ways, I think we also have to let go of our arrogance as part of the empire. The fact is, the US empire is declining, and we need to get out of the way of the global south countries, because they have been trying to dismantle these three pillars for centuries, and now they are actually making some traction.
Yeah.
So it is important that we know it's a genocide. It is important that we know what's happening in Gaza, but that means that we are just slightly dismantling that third pillar of propaganda.
Absolutely.
And we have to go harder on our government.
We have to go harder.
We have to go harder, but we also have to know we're not the most important people
exactly
in the world.
And on that point of we've got to go harder, one of the things about Frank, one of the first things that I remember him saying, which kind of caught me like this, it was like a bolt, and I can't remember what you were talking about, sorry. But it was something where, in many ways, it looked like the movement was under a lot of pressure. We're under a lot of pressure, like legal pressure, etc., bannings, prescriptions. And you were making a call for us to go harder. You were saying, actually, this is a sign that we're winning and we need to go harder. They are on the run.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's coming at horrific cost to Palestinians because they're experiencing a genocide. And I agree with what some of the panelists have said, that it's both a genocide and a war. Both can be true. I think that what I would say, I guess I would say two things, right? First is that this crisis of Zionism, and then the second is what can we do about it? So it seems to me that Zionism is certainly in a crisis. I think before it started this more open phase of the genocide in October 2023, because a lot of people would say that Zionism is an inherently genocidal project. It's premised on the idea that what's needed is a so-called Jewish state that will be racially pure. And so Zionism has always viewed non-Jewish Palestinians as a demographic threat to the racial purity of their desired apartheid state. And so from the Nakba, from before the Nakba, the entire project has always been, through various mechanisms, more or less violent, expel as many non-Jewish Palestinians as possible. So it's inherently genocidal. It's always been premised upon the land has no people, right? From before the Zionist entity was created, right?
Yeah.
So it's always been premised upon dehumanizing racism. And then in October 2023, it's as though the architects of this horrific project, they feel as though they have an excuse, and some of them are very explicit about this. They're like, close to 1,200 people were killed in various ways on October 7th. Now we have an excuse to just do that times 100. And you have ministers currently saying, we're killing 100 Palestinians a day and no one seems to be doing anything about it. They're very, very explicit about what their goal is. They're like, kill as many of them as possible. There was this obscene suggestion about South Sudan, I think I read, where they were saying, maybe we could relocate 2 million people to South Sudan. You've got Tony Blair through Boston Consulting Group saying, how do we reconfigure Gaza so that it becomes Jewish?
Yeah.
It's the most nakedly, obscenely racist colonialism, and it's certainly genocidal. And the crisis of Zionism comes from the fact that everyone can now see that, right? Before October 2023, I don't want to make assumptions, but I think maybe a lot of people in this tent were like, this seems complicated, I'm not sure how I feel about this. Now everyone's like, no, I fully understand whose side I'm on, right? And I've taken to saying that, and forgive me if this is an overly playful metaphor, I got into a lot of trouble because I shared an image of a bulldozer breaking through the apartheid fence on October 7th, right? That's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. When you talk about domination, it's like you put 2 million people, more than 2 million people in a concentration camp and tell them that they're animals, and they found this way to break out of it with this beautiful blue sky. It's like, it's stunning. It's a reassertion of dignity. It's like, they're the best of us. It's like, it's humans refusing to be dominated. It's everything that my politics is about. It speaks to me on a profound level, and everyone saw that, and they can't put the genie back in the bottle. They see a people rising up and refusing to be dominated, and if that mentality catches on, then capitalism, the crisis of Zionism becomes a crisis of global capitalism. So I'm here to suggest that, like Zionism, I think it's over. I don't think Zionism comes back from this. I think it's losing the Jewish diaspora, which is an important part of how the Zionist military reproduces itself, right? It recruits every Jew, like the Law of Return 1950 says every Jew may return to Israel as an ole, right? So it recruits Jews from all around the world and then makes them serve in its colonial genocidal military. A lot of Jews from the diaspora don't want to do that anymore. I think the ordinary person on the street, even in Western countries, views Zionism and Zionists with open disgust. And my point about the fence is that, like, they smashed through the fence. There's no fence left for people to sit on, right? So, like, the Palestinians smashed it. There is no middle ground now. You're either in favor of the people who broke out of a concentration camp and who were being told by their captors that they were animals, or you're in favor of the people keeping them in that concentration camp. And so the point is, just like that woman who asked me, like, are you a liberal or a communist? Like, we have to ask ourselves, are you an anti-Zionist or a Zionist? There is no middle ground left. And so we need to take that energy out of this space, and just, when we encounter people who are still trying to be on the fence, it's like, no, are you a liberal, like, or a communist? Are you an anti-Zionist or a Zionist? If you're a Zionist, you are in favor of the mass murder of Palestinians because they're deemed to be a racial threat. You are a fascist. And what do we do to fascists? We fucking fight them until they're defeated.
Okay. So I'm going to do that thing. I'm going to do that thing that I know will be in the back of some people's minds. So how do you respond to the stories of mass rapes and murders and all of that happened? How do you respond? When you speak like that and somebody brings that up, how do you respond?
There's lots of... I can cover that. I think that we should be principled in a way that our enemies aren't. We hold ourselves to standards that our enemies don't, and we should condemn sexual violence where it happens. If sexual violence is the hill that Zionists want to die on, they've chosen a losing strategy. We have video footage of Zionists engaged in that horrific stay-at-home, whatever you call it, torture facility. So it's clear that sexual violence takes place and that it is overwhelmingly the responsibility of Zionists, which view Palestinians as subhuman, and we know they view them as subhuman because people like Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, tell us that, right? They say human animals, right? So we should be principled, right? It strikes me that I haven't heard any survivors or complainants from the Israeli side that emerged immediately post October 7th. And a lot of the people, even the hostages, for example, who were taken out of Gaza, were extremely critical of the Netanyahu government, some of them. And so what seems to be happening is the weaponization of allegations, not with the consent of the people making any such allegations, right? So number one, it's just on a principled feminist perspective, it's obnoxious. But also, and I also just think that we should hold ourselves to a higher standard, but the key framework here is that of atrocity propaganda, right?
Okay.
Now, the crucial thing about atrocity propaganda is that, clearly some atrocities happened on October 7th, like a lot of civilians were killed, right? Who exactly was responsible for those atrocities is not clear because the Israeli government is not interested in there being clarity about what actually happened. But the point about atrocity propaganda is that it can even be true that actual atrocities did happen, right? Yeah. Atrocity propaganda is lying about atrocities like 40 beheaded babies, but it's also telling a true story about certain atrocities that did happen and then using that to commit atrocities times 100, using that to commit a genocide. So whenever people come at us with atrocity propaganda, we should just name it for what it is. You're saying you are wielding people's undeniable trauma to justify genocide, and isn't that just Zionism in a nutshell? Jewish people suffered the horrific trauma of the Holocaust, and Zionism is the notion that should be consciously wielded to justify the mass murder of Palestinians. You don't solve a Holocaust by committing another Holocaust. You don't solve racism by committing more racism. And you don't solve the problem of fascist Nazi Germany that said, if you're Jewish, you are fundamentally a racial impurity to be solved with genocidal violence, by saying, be a Zionist. If you are a Palestinian, you are a racial problem to be solved with genocidal violence. It's the same problem, and we are principled. We walk the line. We oppose sexual violence. We oppose racism. We oppose fascism. We oppose Zionism. That's the line we've got to walk.
Absolutely. And I think I heard somebody from the floor say something like, why are you saying it's stories? You know, are you denying that? That's not what I'm doing. I'm referring to the fact that those events have been so propagandized that it's impossible really for most people to know what really happened and who really did what. And the fact that the Israelis will not allow proper evidence to be taken on that means that we are unable to actually talk about that in any real way, which is part of the purpose, which is a bit like Ileana said, I think, which is part of the purpose, is to actually confuse us. Coming to you, Chris, talking about confusion, I think it would be interesting perhaps for you to give us a view about the Labour Party in this, not because you represent the Labour Party now, but you know these people, you know the people in government, many of them very well. What's going down there in terms of this issue?
Well, the Labour Party is controlled by Israel, isn't it? I mean, when I was a member of Parliament, around half of the Parliamentary Labour Party were members of the so-called Labour Friends of Israel. And Sir Keir Starmer, in his leadership bid, when he was speaking at the Jewish Labour movement, made it very clear that he said he supported Zionism without qualification. And I think that's the root of the problem, that these people are entirely in the pockets of the Israel lobby. They are the Israel lobby, if truth be told. And that's why I'm hopeful, why indeed we have to ensure that this surge of support for a potentially new party is a thoroughgoing anti-Zionist political party that will have no truck whatsoever with Zionism, that will have no truck with Zionists inside the party, that will actually unambiguously support the armed resistance of the Palestinian people against the Zionist entity. and is unambiguously an anti-imperialist, pro-working class, anti-neoliberal political party, because that is the only way, it seems to me, that we're going to actually turn this juggernaut around, which is so at the moment totally in the pockets of these genocide heirs.
Okay, but let's get back to the present-day Labour Party now. There are many people there. There are many people who actually claim to be left-wingers in the Labour Party, who are being extraordinarily quiet on this party. On this issue? What's going on, Chris, there?
Well, I mean, as I was saying yesterday, the entirety of the Parliamentary Labour Party are careerists. They put their career before everything else, and they're making the calculation at the moment that they are better off inside the Labour Party in terms of hanging on to their parliamentary career, so-called, if they do keep their heads down. There is a line, isn't there, in the red flag, the so-called Labour Party anthem, which says, "Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here." The Parliamentary Labour Party was, and is even to a greater extent now, completely comprised of cowards and traitors. There are no good people, it seems to me, and that was proven beyond any shadow of a doubt during the anti-Semitism scam that destroyed the Jeremy Corbyn leadership of the party. And Jeremy's biggest error was in not actually standing up to the Zionist lobby and capitulating to them, constantly apologising for no good reason, and allowing his Praetorian Guard to be thrown under the bus. And in the end, they came for him, didn't they? The Pastor Nehemiah poem, which I quoted yesterday, is apposite. There were nobody left to speak out for him because he failed to speak up for the communists, for the socialists, for the trade unionists and the Jews. And when the Nazis came for him, there was nobody left to speak out. And that's where Jeremy ended up, didn't he? He ended up getting removed from the party. So that's the real problem. There is no way back for the Labour Party. Some people say, it's important to stay inside the Labour Party and fight to reform it. It is beyond that. Our duty now is to destroy the Labour Party and replace it with something better.
Yeah, I'm afraid I really do believe that too. One of my major aims in terms of activism in the next election is to see the Labour Party destroyed. I never thought I would say it, but I do say it. Okay, Patrick, have you got a kind of America view? Have you got a world view to put into what this genocide stuff is really about? I'm really interested, because as you know, I also have an American passport, and the extraordinary influence of the Israeli lobby in America. And I always think British politics is about 20, 25 years behind that of the UK. Is that how you see it, or how would you see it?
That gap has significantly been closed in recent years, but I think so. I'm looking at how is this? Looking at the situation right now, the fact that it's been able to progress as far as it has, how is this happening? How is this able to happen in this day and age when we're so well informed? Everybody has the world of information at their fingertips. We're supposed to be the most well-informed generation in the history of the human race.
Yeah.
And yet, this is happening. So what is the mechanism? How is this happening? Two things I can tell you from an American point of view, and I'll speak from my own ignorance growing up. I wasn't aware growing up in America that there were, at least in my formative years, that there were Christian communities in the Middle East.
Yeah.
That was not, ever made visible in the media or anything like that, other than if you study history, obviously you learn these things. But the average American wouldn't know that there was a Christian enclave in Palestine.
Yeah.
They just, even though Bethlehem is there, and they just can't marry the two. It's the Jews versus the Muslims.
Yeah.
So that's part of that polarity, and it's no coincidence that this situation is happening now at the same time the immigration issue is ascendant.
Absolutely.
And this is also used to manipulate people's views, to polarize the population along these battle lines, okay?
Yeah.
That's another mechanism. And the other one is atrocity propaganda. There's never been a genocide in history, whether that's Angola, whether that's Rwanda, whether that's Nazi Germany that hasn't been based, a pogrom that hasn't been based on a lie.
Yeah.
Or a bunch of lies that have been injected into the conversation. If you study history, even the Mau Mau in Kenya, there's too many examples. It has to be based on a lie, and a whole series of lies. U.S. colonization of the Native American lands had all. If you look at the reports, the United States and Spanish-American War, the invasion of the Caribbean, and it's all based on lies and exaggerations, racially loaded stereotypes, total misinformation.
And very often sexualized, isn't it?
Very much.
So, in the First World War, the Germans had raped the women. In the Caribbean, the slaves had raped their masters. It's very often based on stories of rape, isn't it?
That's not an optional feature.
No.
That's a requirement.
Yeah, exactly.
You cannot mobilize a Imagine the Israeli pilot who is 24, 26 years old. How do you motivate a military person to unleash that type of power on a densely populated civilian area? You need an incredible lie, or a bunch of incredible lies, and that's what October 7th provided. And I will say that although we don't have the definitive public inquiry, I think Asa's work on October 7th and others, including the Gray Zone, and I cited Asa and the work that I've done and other of my colleagues, and you can actually, through the process of deduction, work out more or less with a margin of error how many Israeli civilians were actually killed on October 7th. You do so by process of elimination. You look at reportage in the Israeli press at the time. You take out Israeli soldiers, minus that from the 1,200 total, Shin Bet officers, so 300, between 300 and 400 Israeli regulars, then Shin Bet police, that's between 50 and 60, and you start working down process of elimination, and then you have the Hannibal Directive. This is where the Israeli military unleashed the force of American weaponry on Israelis in settlements, okay? The Dahia Directive, the Hannibal Directive, is the same thing. And then you get down, the actual number of unarmed, non-reservist, Israeli innocent, quote, civilians, you're talking potentially in the hundreds. Now, that's a very different global conversation than this is the worst atrocity of Jews being killed since the Holocaust. That was the line, that was Piers Morgan's line, that was everybody's line. So that motivates to say we want revenge. So they talk about a blood libel. Israelis use that a lot. You blood libeled us. This was the biggest blood libel against the Palestinians, and is used to justify something that is just unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
You're talking about gaslighting.
Yeah.
So how?
Again.
So people's paralysis is because they don't know where. People are confused, like us in England, and the average, middle class person. We don't know where to stand on this issue because we're afraid.
Yeah.
Are we siding with terrorists here? Are we on the side of the bloodthirsty barbarians here? Are we with Israel, who's just trying to defend itself, and it's being caught between this chasm that people have this moral paralysis? And this is how this has been able to continue, now going into the 24th month by the end of next month. 2 years. 2 years. You could have never told me in my life that I would watch this for 2 straight years. And most people cannot lift a finger to do a damn thing about it because they don't know how to act. We don't have an instruction book.
I think it's not just that people don't know how to act. That's the only thing I'd say about this. People are terrified. They're terrified of saying the wrong thing. They're terrified of their employer being informed. They're terrified about what their college placement, what will happen there. They're terrified about what their friends will say. I mean, many of us on the panel have actually experienced that ourselves. But, if you've got a family to support, if you're trying to, get a house, get a job, whatever, it makes it even more difficult. And
one last thing, the last mechanism is the terrorism label. So what you're seeing now is an extension of the war on terror. So that means that if I label Hamas a terrorist organization, then pretty much that's weapons free.
Job
All
done.
bets are off. I can do it as I wish, as the
done.
U.S. did in Fallujah, as the Israelis are doing, have done many times in Gaza,
Yeah.
and have done to an atrocious degree now. And this is and this is what they did in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Because of Hezbollah, because Israel has compelled the U.S. and the British and some of their allies to designate or proscribe Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., any enemy of Israel as a terrorist organization. So therefore, we can take out a whole city block, a village, a neighborhood, and if you think it's going to stop in Gaza, and Craig will tell you what could be done to South Lebanon if there is a civil war in Lebanon, and the precedent has been set that that's okay. This overwhelming brutality, and nobody's going to stop. Who is going to stand up and restrain the Israelis? Nobody. And so the region is terrified about what could happen in Lebanon and other places.
Look, I can see that a number of people on the panel are wanting to dip in, but I am really keen, because that's just what I like to do. I like to hear from you. So I would really, and the panelists, obviously, they're going to ask questions. You'll get a chance to say more. It would be really great to hear from you and hear some questions, challenge people, ask for more information, anything it is that you want to do.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for educating me. I classify myself as being fairly uneducated in everything, but from yesterday and today, what you have taught me has been exceptional. I am one of those people that has watched the news and have fallen victim to the propaganda, to the words, to the terror of this happening to my children. I am blessed to have a child here who's trying not to be with me, who then after your talk yesterday said, and she's just finished her degree, said, this is one view, Mum, you look at every view, look at everything, question everything. And you guys have activated me to not believe in that propaganda, to stand up as me, just a normal person, to go, I'm not willing to accept this anymore.
Good.
I want to question more. I want to know more. I'm going to be following everyone and learning more, and I'm going to stand up because if we can activate the normal populace, we have a chance of change.
But everybody here must know at least 20 people that they could talk to about this issue, and some of those can also be changed. Okay, another question.
Hi, thank you. It's great hearing from everybody. I think it's probably more of a statement than a question. I don't know. It's just when I hear interviews on TV, and I know a lot of you I've seen on TV, and that I get very frustrated when the usual retorts come back from the interviewer about October the 7th and the 1,200 people dying, and I want to hear more people like you two guys standing up and saying, I'm questioning that, or that's rubbish, or everybody's pussyfooting around it like they're scared to say what's real, and I think that's why people don't get it. Because everybody's scared, and I can understand why, but people need to be strong, I think, especially now.
Can I respond to that quickly?
I mean, that's why we need alternative voices, and that's why they try and silence us. Frank?
I think your comment is really valuable, and thank you for making it. I think a few things, right? Like, it's okay to be scared, right? Fear is a very human emotion, right? Imagine how Palestinians feel right now, just completely terrified. I really actually struggle to imagine how they must be feeling right now, right? So it's okay to be scared, but I do think it's important to notice the difference between the stakes for Palestinians, especially in Gaza, and the stakes for us here in Britain. The stakes here are so much lower, and I find that makes me feel less afraid. It's like, okay, people tried to privately prosecute me for things that I've said on social media. People have dragged me in front of my professional regulator and told me that I should never be allowed to practice law again. And those are some stakes. There's some personal stakes. That's really not nothing. But compared to a genocide, it just feels like the stakes are very, very low. And what I would also say is that courage is about facing your fear, right? Like, it's one thing to be fearless and not to feel fear at all. And some people are so traumatized. You know, we all saw images of Palestinian teenagers in Adidas tracksuits running up to Merkava tanks and strapping bombs to it. It struck me that a lot of those people weren't courageous. They were fearless. They were so traumatized that they were like, I'm going to go and do this mad stuff now, right? And that's horrific that they're so traumatized in that way. But those of us who do still feel a certain amount of fear, I think that courage is something that we cultivate collectively. And so people touched earlier on losing your job, being dragged in front of your regulator, even being criminally prosecuted, as a lot of people are, for showing solidarity with Palestine Action. The way to respond to that is collective. If your boss comes to you and threatens you with some kind of consequences for taking action against the fascist ideology of Zionism, if you get into trouble, the answer, and I help a lot of my clients with this all the time, it's like, get a team of people around you, speak to people you trust, and a problem halved is a problem shared. I remember when I was a kid at school, I would often get into trouble for sharing like IRA propaganda and stuff in school. And when you were in trouble on your own, it was terrifying. But when you're in trouble with even just one other kid, it just felt almost like fun, and it was fine. It's like, look, we're in trouble together, but it's so much less scary to be in it together. Courage is something we cultivate collectively, and courage is something we have a duty to cultivate. We have a duty to our brothers and sisters, our comrades in Palestine, to cultivate courage right now. We owe it to them as fellow humans to find a way to escalate our response to the British government's active participation in this genocide. We have to do it. We have to.
Thank you. Great.
Thanks very much, everyone. My hands are full, so it's a bit trickier. Obviously, thanks to everybody. I have got a question. Thanks, Glenn, for everything you're doing. In relation to the gentleman behind me who mentioned about the what happened and whether some of it's lies, etc., etc., I just want to bring up the fact and ask people about it on the panel here. On my own talk show, I've had an ex-IDF soldier on there. This is way back when it happened, saying that it's impossible that could happen, that they could get through there without the Israeli regime knowing, yeah? And consequently, other IDF soldiers, and I know it's a controversial thing, and it's hard to pinpoint it, but it's something that has to be spoken about, I think, and other IDF soldiers are coming out and saying they let them through, right? Now, I just think that's so important for people to realize, because that's the start of this whole thing, and they've wanted that to happen for bloody decades. They've wanted an excuse for decades to actually wipe Gaza clean of the scumbag Palestinians that they hate. I was in apartheid South Africa. I married a black woman, as you know, and I've seen it there, and I see it in Gaza. It's disgusting. They see them as filth, like they did with the black South Africans, and I was shot at there because of it. And like the rest of you, I've been persecuted. I've been crucified by the Guardian newspaper, by the BBC, and by the Times. I'm not here to talk about that, but I know what it feels like to have the courage to stand up and say something. And back to that lady over there, yes, thank you for coming today. And what we're seeing now, on a final exciting note, is the ghastly and dreadful and sickening anti-Semitic shield, so brilliantly designed and to stop everyone speaking anything against Israel for decades and decades and decades. At last, the anti-Semitic sick shield is finally dissolving as we see millions of people having the courage to step forward now and expose Israel for what it is. Hallelujah. Thank you, everybody. And don't stop coming forward.
I mean, I don't know any of you who ever follow what Piers Morgan say, but I saw him online the other day, and even he was saying, how did the Shin Bet not know what was going on October the 7th? This is unreal. Asa, have you got anything to add on that?
There has been... I'm sceptical of this, I have to say. I mean, I think the jury's still out, to be honest, but I can talk about the Hannibal Directive, I think. Patrick mentioned the Hannibal Directive, and for those of you who don't know, the Israeli military has had a policy for about 30 years, since 1986, called the Hannibal Directive, and it is named after. What that directive says is that there was a initially, it was a secret order. It was later exposed in the Israeli media, and what the order says is that if there are Israeli soldiers who are in the process of being captured by Palestinian or Lebanese or other Arab resistance fighters, the Israeli military can target those soldiers to be killed. And the reason for that is to stop them being captured and held alive, because there's been over the years, in the 80s and later on, there's been prisoner exchanges between Hezbollah and Israel, the Lebanese resistance guerrilla fighters, and Palestinian resistance fighters and Israel. There's been prisoner exchanges, and those have been very uneven. So, like in one case, around about 1,000 Palestinian political prisoners were released in exchange for one captured Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, if some of you remember that. And so that is a political and military disaster for Israel, and they want to stop those prisoner exchanges happening. And so they would rather kill their own soldiers than allow them to be held alive and then exchanged in that way. And so Israel has this doctrine, military doctrine, on its books. And like I said, initially it was secret, it was later exposed, and it's really kind of an open secret within Israeli society. And what happened on October the 7th en masse was, I've reported on this in some detail, and we've reported on it at the Electronic Intifada in some detail. What happened on October the 7th was, for the first time that we know of, that not only was that doctrine applied while the Palestinian offensive was happening on the morning of October the 7th, 2023, but it was actually extended to Israeli non-combatants. So Israeli, quote-unquote civilians, settlers within the border communities, the frontier communities around Gaza. There's also kind of a grey area of who, some people argue there's no such thing as an Israeli civilian. I wouldn't go that far, but there's certainly an aspect in which these so-called civilian communities surrounding the Gaza Strip are actually militarized colonies, right? And they're actually put there for that purpose, to colonize the land, to stop Palestinians from returning in their homes in what is present-day Israel. And one of those frontier communities next to Gaza is actually, in Hebrew, is called Magen, which is a shield. It means shield. It's literally a shield. So they're using their civilians, quote-unquote civilians, as literal human shields.
Yeah.
So anyway, on October the 7th, the Israeli military unleashed its, awesome firepower, awesome in
There's actually pictures, isn't there?
Yeah.
Which show damage to hundreds of cars, which could not have been done with the firepower that Hamas have. Go online, you can see it.
I've studied it in quite some detail, reported on it. And just as a common sense thing, like you see those cars, for example, just burnt out, destroyed. Not only burnt out, but actually they're wrecks. It can only have been done by helicopter gunships, potentially by even F-16s. We know that this happened, and it's actually reported in the Israeli media that it happened. And so the only question is that how many of the 1,100 or so Israelis, including Israeli combatants who were killed on October 7th, how many were killed by Palestinians and how many killed by Israel? I've studied it. I came to the conclusion it was probably hundreds that were killed by Israel as part of the Hannibal Directive. But the bottom line is that we don't know, and the reason we don't know is that Israel is actively blocking a UN investigation from doing it. The UN tried to investigate it, Israel stopped it from happening, and they've been covering it up ever since, to the extent that they actually buried a lot of the dead without any autopsies. Well, there was no autopsies at all, actually.
Yeah.
And they even buried some of the cars on a religious pretext that they had blood on them.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's what they did to those ambulance drivers. Maybe, when they buried the Palestinian ambulance drivers who had their phones showing the massacre that was going on to them. Maybe they were actually trying to be kind to them or something. You know, I mean, the ludicrous stories that have come out about this are just extraordinary, aren't they?
Yeah, to this question I'll come back there. This question goes to the title of this talk. And the reason, if you look at a poster outside, we're talking about if there's a massive imbalance of power, like if I saw a grown man battering a child, I wouldn't call that a fight. That's something else. It's not a fight. And with Gaza, where you have air, land and sea, the most high-tech military in the world, battering every single angle of it, targeting it. And in response to that, you have heroic people, but unarmed in comparison. I just can't call that a war. A war to me is when you have two armies, not equal, but you know what I mean, a war. So what, is there another word? I get genocide and war can both happen at the same time, but is there a better word than war?
I think I hear what you say, but and I'm sure many people here have thought about the history of anti-colonial resistance movements and how they actually win. You think about Algeria, right? A stunning victory by the FLN, right? The Front Libération Nationale, that drove the French colonizers out of France, and Algeria is no longer a French colony, right? One of the most successful instances of anti-colonial resistance, and it took 1 million Algerian deaths. 1 million Algerian deaths in a country of about 24 million people. That is a staggering price to pay for dignity and freedom. That's the price that the Algerians paid. The Viet Cong in Vietnam, 2 million people gave their lives to drive the Yankee imperialists out of Vietnam. Another stunning sacrifice to pay for freedom and dignity. These are the realities of the numbers that we are talking about. It is a war. It's an extremely asymmetrical war.
Yeah.
I hear what you say, but when you make this analogy with a child, Palestinians are not children. They are adults, and they are gonna win. It may come at a staggering cost to them, but they will never stop struggling against the fascist forces of Zionism. And we have to recognize, just because this will probably be my last chance to say something to you folks, my 3 provocations, riffing off of your point, right? 3 provocations that I really want you to dwell on and take away from you, right? The first is my point about Zionist versus anti-Zionist. We all need to leave this tent being like, there is no room for any more ambiguity, right? We are all anti-Zionists, and when you encounter people who are still unsure, you need to provoke them and say, you need to choose anti-Zionism, and if you don't, you're choosing Zionism, which means you're choosing racism, apartheid, and fascism, right? The second provocation is that we need to escalate our own government's participation in this genocide. We need to escalate our opposition to it. We need to do it in a way that's collective. Go into your workplaces, your trade unions, any collective organizations, your faith groups, go into it and find ways to collectively escalate. And the third provocation is that we need to explicitly support the Palestinian armed resistance. Palestinians have a right to fight against the people who are committing a genocide against them, and we owe them our unflinching solidarity. They have a right to fight against the fascist Zionists that are trying to colonize them.
Right on. Okay.
So I have a direct question, I think, for Ileana. Do I have the right name?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right name.
Oh, thank God. I'm interested in if you could expand a little bit on the Five Eyes concept. Well, not the concept, but the Five Eyes. Recently, we've seen Mark Carney has been elected. We've seen Canada trying to say things about Palestine, like recognize statehood with France, and now we're seeing Australia as well coming in. I'm Australian. Okay. I've got a vested interest here. Do you see that Mark Carney's, and I know he's part of the capitalists, like absolutely frickin' everything, but he knows where the bodies are buried, and it just feels like something's happening, and I may be grasping at straws of hope here. But Mark Carney, Anthony Albanese, he was a bloody good socialist when he was a lot younger. Do you see that there is something changing there?
Okay, so I'm not an expert on Australia. I did work with Stella Assange, but I'm not an expert on Australia. But I'll just say this part of it, which is that the whole point of this, where I said that the US empire is declining, it is at its most belligerent, but it's also at the moment where there's most contradiction. Yeah. So there are avenues, and this is why I was saying about us, like, being aware that we're not like the most important part of the resistance, but we can be part of the resistance, and our only real way to get any of the socialist policies, I believe, that Chris Williamson has been advocating, for example, is to separate us from imperialism. So, yeah, I would say it's just like what I was saying with those 3 pillars of coercion, right? It's not so simple. It is always a good sign when someone is outwardly anti-imperial. And also Trump has been very useful because he's such a gangster imperialist.
Yeah.
He's so overt that people who might not have even understood that the US was an empire are starting to look at some of his policies and are thinking, well, but the truth is he's just the same trajectory of US imperialism, but just with his mask off. And he's actually been quite useful in terms of, it's harder for countries like maybe Australia, even though they're in the inner circle, to be very obviously pro-Trump, maybe. There's certain factions that find it embarrassing.
Well, they're all addicted to the IDF's flipping military crap and the Israeli military industries. They're all like pimped out to the Israelis.
Yeah, well, and also the US empire, because look at AUKUS. How does that benefit Australia to put them against China? And make no mistake, China is the target. I mean, I think that's one of the things with Gaza is that I'm not minimizing at all, and I hope no one thought I was minimizing the genocide in any way, shape, or form, but we cannot separate that from the rest of the global south, because these things will keep happening, because that is what imperialism does, and so therefore it's not so simple, and that's why I'm saying those 3 pillars of coercion are really important to look at, because there are alternatives that are sort of trying to come out in terms of BRICS, in terms of Belt and Road Initiative, for example, that China's doing. And the propaganda to take those things down is at its all-time high. So I'm saying, like, in regards to your question, which, sorry if I'm not answering it properly, I'm just saying, like, there are moments of optimism that we should be consciously trying to encourage, or, very forcefully trying to encourage with our own politicians, but we have to understand that we're part of a wider whole, and the global majority, like I was saying, the global south is 145 countries. The global majority is against this US imperialism.
Yeah. Also, I'd just like to say that the small slivers of hope, to your point, Frank, 100%, like I sit in a super conservative area where I'm so actively involved in my community, and getting as many people intellectually stimulated to actually challenge what is going on and to challenge the narrative that they've been force-fed their entire lives. So this is just part of it, so thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question, I'm afraid. I think we've got time for one more. Should we do David?
Thanks. I wanted just to add to Frank's list of provocations. I think that in addition to escalating against the complicity of the UK government in the genocide, we need to be escalating against the sources of support for Zionism in this country, which are engaged on a daily basis in sending money to the settlements, to the IDF, through the 3,000 Zionist charities which exist in this country. We need also to escalate against the Zionist movement directly in this country, and I'd like to hear what the panel have to say about that.
Who'd like to take that? The Zionist organisations in the UK. Yeah, Asa?
Yes, I agree.
Is that
there's a group that is illegal to support, so I don't know what I can say legally.
Does it begin with P?
Well, there is a group that I think should be de-proscribed, which is called Palestine Action, and before they were banned, they were doing absolutely amazing work in taking direct action against the Israeli arms companies in this country, and there is. I'm watching my words here.
Okay. Watch your words.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to come before the court again in November, and they're working to be deprescribed, and there's a lot of optimism about that. But around the wider point that David's making of the Zion, I mean, David's being a little bit humble because he's kind of the pioneer of a lot of this research of the level. I mean, I've learned a lot from you, David, of not just the pro-Israel lobby in this country, but the analysis of the Zionist movement in this country, which has, it is kind of at the forefront of a lot of this, and in propping up British support for Israel, and yeah, I mean, we need to be campaigning against those organisations. I mean, I agree with what we were saying earlier about destroying the Labour Party.
Yeah.
But if we were still in the Labour Party, say we lived in a different world where you had succeeded, Chris, in convincing the party to adopt the open elections, for example, and the Labour Party still had the left in it, and say there was a Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister or something. I think the struggle would be to purge, let's not mince words, purge the Zionist organisations from the Labour Party, for example.
Okay, I'm going to give
the JLM.
I'm going to give Chris the last word because
briefly
we're looking
on that.
to
I think
now.
absolutely we could have changed the course of history. I mean, it really was within our grasp. It was in touching distance. We climbed to the top of the mountain. We glimpsed the promised land, and then we were dragged back down. And that was a failure of leadership. It wasn't a failure of the grassroots. It was a failure of leadership. Failure, I regret to say, of Jeremy, a failure of the Socialist Campaign Group, a failure of the trade union leadership. But we potentially have another opportunity, and we mustn't flunk it this time. And David is absolutely right, and David's done some incredible work. And frankly, the research that David has done is absolutely groundbreaking. And obviously I host, should I say, Palestine Declassified, and David does, a huge amount of the research for that. And David has said to me, it's even shocked him, and he was probably the foremost expert on the insidious impact of Zionism in this country. And David has said to him on a number of occasions how he's even shocked himself at the extent of their influence in this country. So we absolutely have to expose these Zionist organisations. We absolutely have to call them out. And just picking up on the point about people being terrified, I understand that. That's why it's so important for people who do know what is going on, for people who have a platform, for people who have a political platform in particular, but other people like Frank and others like Patrick and others, and obviously Asa and so on, with a media platform. We absolutely have to use that platform to get the message out there, to give people the confidence to be able to speak out and not be fearful, because the Labour movement says a lot, doesn't it, about unity is strength, an injury to one is an injury to all. And they were lacking, weren't they, when we had that opportunity. So we have to give some genuine meaning to unity is strength by standing together in solidarity to call out these scumbags in the Zionist movement, to call out the scumbags who facilitate them, and to come back to this point about this new movement which is hopefully being created. Let's make sure that it doesn't make those same catastrophic mistakes that the Corbyn movement made, or the leadership of the Corbyn movement made. We have a historic opportunity once again, potentially. For Christ's sake, we have to make sure that it doesn't go down that same path. And that's up to all of us in here and everybody else who we have interactions with, to make sure that we hold the leadership's feet to the fire to bloody well deliver for us this time.
I mean, I think that is a great way to finish, because the power with us, and we have such an exciting potential future coming up with the new party. But this time, it has to be a different party to the Labour Party. It has to be properly anti-racist, and it's got to be properly member-led. So power to the people, guys, and let's continue that struggle. Power.